Hi everyone, and welcome to the first lesson in crops 2. We're discussing hydrangeas. We'll be going through basically just about a crop a week in this course, and of course there's many crops that are grown, but I try to hit all the major ones that you would come across, or at least ones in categories of similar growth habits. So there's some logic to this. Anyways, it does say here adapted from Wayne Brown. Wayne Brown was a hort extension expert for Ontario, for OMAFRA. He retired a number of years ago, and he taught this course for a while. But when he retired, they found yours truly. Sorry. So, hydrangeas. I always say if you're going to grow a crop, you should know where it comes from, and that better helps you understand what it's looking for, right? Now, obviously, a lot of the cultivars we grow are so bred and, whatnot, mutated and et cetera to make them something that we really want for the customer. But at their heart, these plants are still related to their original genetics. So the Hydrangea macrophylla, there's many hydrangeas, but we grow primarily Hydrangea macrophylla in greenhouses. And of course, the first thing I want to highlight here is Hydra, the Greek goddess of water or whatever it is. I don't know. Anyways, water. Lots of water. That's why it's in the name. So that's the first thing we know these plants are looking for is water. And if you look at precipitation, these plants are originally from Honshu Island in Japan. So lots of water and fairly mild climate. Toronto's sitting at 43 degrees north latitude, and Japan, Honshu Island, sitting at 35. So it's a little closer to the equator. Not by much, 10 degrees, whatever. I'll take it. These days I would. It's obviously in the Pacific, so it's mild. You're looking at like -1 to 8, to highs of 30. But look at the rainfall. Like, this is crazy. Probably a lot of you didn't realize how much rain and snow Japan gets. 180 centimeters of rainfall on Honshu Island. And they have high humidity all summer. Like, it's really high. So it's a different climate. This next slide's gonna throw you off. This is what winter looks like in Honshu Island. I am seriously jealous. I can remember as a kid jumping off a roof into snow drifts, but maybe I was just really small and those drifts weren't that big. But in my mind, they were like this. But we don't get snow like this anymore. I'm seriously jealous. So they get around 2.5 meters of snow. So remember, the precipitation, rainfall, whatever, is liquid, and we turn that into snow, it expands quite a bit, right? So 2.5, so not just in the summer, but in the winter, 2.5 meters of snow. That's crazy. They have tons of skiing there. There's a part of Japan, that I hope some of you have been there. I've never been. My goal is to go visit Japan sometime in my life when I'm not making video lessons and eating chocolate nonstop. Natural habitat. So it is a woody perennial. That's important to note, especially later when we talk about propagation, because woody perennials have wood. So they tend to be slower growers, and we need slightly stronger hormones to kick them into rooting. We'll talk about that again. Hardy in zones 6 through 8. I've got a map coming up to give you a context if you've forgotten, but that's fairly warm climates. Toronto just barely comes into that. Now, hardy means if we're going to overwinter it, right? Now, remember, in the ornamental world, we grow stuff, people it's beauty, they look at it and then they chuck it. I know a lot of you have problems with that, but that's how it works in the ornamental world. So the leaves are opposite. They are sort of rounded, ovate. They have a serrated edge. They look like an ash leaf. 2 types of blooms, mop heads and lace caps. I've got some pictures coming up. And the colors tend to range from white to pink to purple to blue. There are no reds, oranges, or yellows. It's not possible. Here's your zones 6 and 7. We don't have an 8 in Canada. We're not warm enough. So Toronto just barely makes the cut. So maybe there's some varieties, hydrangeas, hardier ones that, you may not sell as an ornamental in a pot, but as a garden center specimen. Some of those are hardy enough that they can survive. Axial buds. You're going to hear this term coming up. This is at the axis of a leaf where the petiole meets the stem, okay? So they have axial buds and they have an apex bud. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. So flowers form on previous year's growth. So that's important to note. Just like your cane berries, raspberries and stuff like that, or grapes, previous year's growth. So that means that, we're trimming stuff, but leaving some stuff behind for the next year so that we have flowers. Flowers initiate in the fall, so late summer to early fall. So that also helps you understand that this is a seasonal flower. Basically, we grow the plant, we set the flowers in the fall, and then they have to overwinter, and then we force the flowers. So those flowers are forming late summer, early fall, when we have short days and cool nights. So those are conditions that the plants are looking for: short days and cool nights in order to set bud. And then they have to go through a dormancy in order for them to flower. That's around 1,000 hours of cooling. And they don't flower very well in low light. So, typically when they force in the spring, you want to make sure you have enough light on the plants. Some farms use supplemental lighting, but I think the way Ontario's climate works, that's really not necessary. Interesting term, remontancy. I don't know if you've ever heard that one before. It is conceivable that if you took a forced hydrangea, it could flower one more time in that season, but I think it's really difficult to pull that off. But not impossible. Interesting fact about the flowers, as we call them, they're actually what's called an inflorescence. So what you're looking at here in this image here, these lace caps kind of help identify it. The entire thing is called an inflorescence, but the flowers are actually just these little guys in here. So what you're looking at is all the colorful bits are modified sepals. So they are not fertile. They're not actually a flower. So that's an important fact. Now, when we look at the different structures, I just showed you a lace cap, which, there's all the fertile flowers in the middle that are small. And then there's your mop head, which is where all the fertile flowers are buried down within below the dome of sepals. Here's a little close-up looking at the actual flowers. Nothing unusual here. You've got your anthers and pistils. So another thing we have to consider when we're growing a crop is, what are we growing it to? What's the spec? Buyers have specific requirements: number of flowers, the size of the plant, the size of the pot, that kind of thing. So typically with hydrangeas, we're looking at around 1/2 meter tall plant. Almost all are grown in 6-inch pots, although in recent years that has diversified to a small percentage in 4-inch and a small percentage in larger, maybe 8-inch pots. Depends on the variety. Some of them are very vigorous and produce very large plants, and they can get away with it. But a lot of the consumer, display settings, everything's set up for 6-inch pots. Blue is by far the most popular color. Again, the consumer hybrids, it's kind of is it a chicken and egg thing? Like, is it the consumers are expecting blue because we could grow blue back in the 1960s and they just got used to it? Or do they really want blue? Because personally, I like the pink and mauves better, but I mean, look at the stats. You have to sell 8 to 10 blues to sell 1 pink. Wow. And as far as I'm concerned, the environmental fallout from producing a blue hydrangea is much more extreme than making a pink one. But you'll see what I mean when we get into it. But consumer behavior is a strange thing. So let's go through the stages of production, right? So we're going to start with propagation, then we're going to go to field growth, and then setting buds. Then we're going to talk about storage for like putting in the cooler for the winter, and then we'll talk about pulling them out and forcing them into flower for various holiday seasons. So starting, there's a pictogram. There's your cuttings, rooting, field production, trimming to get branching, bud set, de-leafing, forcing, and finishing off with your final product. Um, so propagation. So stock plants, interesting enough, this is still the case. Stock plants are mainly from Oregon. This is a huge industry in Oregon, not just cannabis people. Oregon has the perfect climate for growing hydrangea. They look like grape fields. Like if you're driving around Niagara and you see all the farms with grapes, in Oregon, you drive around, you'd see rows and rows and rows of hydrangeas. And they grow them to make cuttings. Those cuttings are shipped all over North America and parts of the world. The stems are anywhere from 15 to 40 centimeters. They're almost a foot long sometimes, but in this picture it kind of gives you an idea. In recent years, smaller cuttings have become a little more popular. Those are very large cuttings, but you know. Um, Growers get what's called a butterfly cutting. You'll see there's a leaf here and a leaf here, just like two wings and a butterfly. So that's known as a butterfly cutting. Um, they root in about a month, right? And in terms of rooting compounds, some people use what's called number 1 and some use number 2. These are different strengths of IBA, which is a type of auxin. Um, Before I get in, I got another slide to sort of help clarify that. You'll notice that these leaves are cut. You know, in the slide, the leaves are cut. And this is a compromise. For several reasons they're cut. The first one is that the leaves are pretty big. And if there's no roots and you have a large leaf, that's a large surface area with stomata to encourage transpiration. And water is going to come out of the cutting. Without the roots being there to supply the water, it will dehydrate the stem, causing it to die and rot. So by halving the size of the leaves, we reduce the transpiration rate to reduce the water stress at the cutting. So that improves success. Second point, hydrangeas need to grow straight up for that first rooting and field growth production to get maximum use of space. They do not like having the apical bud or meristem shaded. So by cutting the leaves, we reduce the amount of shading on the apical meristem. So we don't get bent plants, basically. They root at normal temperatures, 21 to 23. You know, typically when you're rooting these is in the spring, these temperatures are perfect. In fact, many aspects of hydrangea production require very little energy input, which is fantastic and makes them very profitable because, you know, in May, June, these are your natural temperatures. It's not hitting 35 degrees Celsius, so it's easy to root them out, get them growing before they go out to the field. Misting, fogging, whatever, propagation, tenting, whatever, you know, tickles your fancy. At Camp's farm that I toured with you, they use misting, but you know, this is showing you the different rooting compounds. So stem root 1, 2, and 3. The percentage, it's hard to read this, but this is 0.2, 0.4, and 0.8% IBA, indole butyric acid. It's a synthetic auxin. So it mimics what plants do normally, which is produce auxin in the apical meristem. It travels down and encourages roots at the bottom of the plant. So typically for herbaceous soft cuttings, we go number 1. So like, for example, your chrysanthemums or petunias, where with the semi-woody, we would go with a number 2. And then number 3 would be for your definitely woody, you know, if you're really determined to root out a piece of a fruiting tree to graft onto something else or whatever, I don't know. But that's what number 3 would be for true woody plants. Yeah, so then the first 48 hours Really important to get that cutting acclimated. Typically, it's coming out of a box that's really humid. They've been bunched together, and then you're going to sprace them out and put them in pots, and they're going to experience a much lower humidity. So a lot of misting at first to get the cuttings acclimated. And again, shading to reduce transpiration a little bit. But again, remember, never cover the growing tip of adjacent cutting, right? Because otherwise the plants will not be straight when they mature in the field. So that's important, not to be greedy when it comes to space on the bench. Next, it's field growth and bud set. So before going to the field, here's some rooted plugs. All right, there's some rooted hydrangea plugs. We need a decently formed root system. So you want to check that. So, you're better off leaving them on the bench to get a better root system before you rush them out to the field for the summer. Like this one here has an excellent root system. I'd say this one is just barely there, if not there, and this one is maybe kind of there. But, the first one, definitely well rooted. Because they are a fine fibrous root, you need to feed them regularly with lower ECs. Thicker, heavier roots tend to be able to handle a little more of an EC. But we don't want ever to let them starve. So you kind of keep them a nice low, constant feed program. They prefer that. Typically, we pot them up in late May or mid-June, depending on when you rooted them, what you're trying to do for a final size on your crop or what your time frame is. We want little or no phosphate in the fertilizer program. Why? Because we want to keep it compact, and for other reasons we'll get into later with respect to color. But at this point, let's say it's to keep the plant compact. We don't want them leggy. You're going to grow them for about a month, maybe a little bit more, and then pinch. Pinch is often a hard pinch, so that means you're removing in stem and apical meristem, not just pinching out the meristem. And then, then we move them out to the field and grow them on. If you are in the greenhouse and your plants are, suffering without enough light, you need grow lights because they will stretch and get and bend over and stuff like that. We can't have them bending over for one of the reasons being that most farms pinch their plants mechanically. That means that there's a horizontal blade, serrated blade that saws back and forth and cuts the crop. So the crop has to be standing straight up in order to be cut properly. So we can't have them bent over. So we need a good sturdy stem. Out in the field, you feed them, grow them on, get them good and big. You need good shoot development, just basically lots of water and sunshine. And we have a really good climate in Ontario for this. Eventually, we're going to head into another pinch in the field. And again, it's a mechanical pinch. I've got a video coming up that shows how that's done. Typically, we try to get that pinch done as soon as we can to make sure that we have good flowers. If our pinch is late, we end up with small flowers or even blind shoots that don't have flowers. That's not ideal. When you're forcing your hydrangea in February, you want it to come up with a bloom at the end of every stem. So it's important to get them on the field, growing, get that second pinch done as soon as possible. Pinching late June to early July typically is where it happens. We want to pinch down to 2 leaf pairs. So this picture is showing you what the product looks like in the end. So you can see how the blade has sort of just gone right across and chopped everything. There's 2 petioles left here. There's the main axial stem. But we're left with 1 pair, 2 pairs of leaves. So that's what we're looking for with our second pinch in the field. So July 5th is typically the last date for where it's possible to pinch and still have a decent sized bloom. Got a video coming up next. I hope it works. If it doesn't, this link here works in your video on Blackboard. Actually, I even added the video in the Blackboard PowerPoint as well. Unfortunately, that made the file a little bit big. Apologies for that. Okay, some relaxing music. Hopefully you don't fall asleep on me there. Actually, it's kind of just relaxing hoedown stuff. I don't know. Anyways, so far as fertilizer goes, here's our first indication of color. We're going to get into this. Obviously, that'll be the later part of the lesson, but um, we know we need a lot of water, but we also want a constant feed of 100 to 150 ppm of nitrogen. Um, we'll do this to get the plants up to the point where we're going to trim them, because we want them to get sort of the fastest growth possible to get in there without being too soft. And the 2820 will let us do that. Then once we've done our trimming and we're outdoor, we're bulking up for next year, we need to work with the fertilizer. And so we make hydrangea blue by adding aluminum to the soil. And one of the things we have to watch is that phosphorus actually binds aluminum and makes it unavailable. So that would reverse the blue pigmentation. So we got to make sure that once we're starting to set flower, so we've done our trimming, we can no longer use that 2820 because it's got a fair amount of phosphorus in it. So typically 20020 or 2220 are used to make sure there's no phosphorus in the mix. We also add a lot of aluminum. And in the field, once you've trimmed and now you're you're growing your plant on for the fall, while it's now growing and bulking up for its final size, you're going to do 3 to 4 applications of aluminum sulfate, and it's a lot, like astonishing amount, 20 to 25 grams, right? This is like how much sugar's in a can of Coke. 20 to 25 grams per 6-inch pot, which works out to about 2 kilograms to 225 liters of water. That's a lot. You know, if you got hundreds of thousands of pots out in the field, you're going through like hundreds of kilograms of aluminum sulfate. And the sulfate and the aluminum help drive the pH down, and lower pH also encourages the blue color. In this little chemical equation here, you can see how aluminum combines with water to form aluminum oxide and releases a proton, which of course makes the water acidic in the soil. But it's a little more complicated than that. Not that I'm going to ask you to memorize this, but we typically use aluminum sulfate as a fertilizer. And when it's combined with water, it reacts to form something that's maybe a little more resembling what you saw up here. But it produces sulfuric acid, which I'm sure you all know inherently is a strong acid. And that helps bring the pH down. So we're doing 2 things. We're adding aluminum, and we're adding sulfur, which can convert it to sulfuric acid, which of course produces all sorts of protons. So we get a low pH and lots of aluminum. So mid-August, we get these applications in, and we get the pH down, and gets us. This is not obviously in flower at this point, but it gets the aluminum in the plant, embedded in the tissues, and into the buds that are starting to grow. We need them in the buds before they are forced next year. So there's already aluminum treatments happening when they're being budded up in the fall. As far as initiating flower, typically some of these things we know already. We talked about flower initiation last term, right? Things like, you know, enough carbon, enough nitrogen, that kind of the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Temperature, your night temperature is important. Photoperiod is important. Watering, light intensity, all these things that, you know, I think are fairly common. But typically as plants enter September, our fall is a cooler, shorter day, and these trigger bud formation. So it's kind of like orchids, you know, they have vegetative growth the summer, and then we go into the fall where there's cooler, shorter days, they start initiating buds. And in this case, those buds need to be dormant before they'll actually open, whereas an orchid, they'll just flower. So in the fall, the shorting days and the cooler days and nights will trigger bud formation. Um, but we need to make sure, of course, that our plants have sufficiently grown, right? They have the right number of leaves, 7 to 8 pairs, have a good carbon to nitrogen ratio. You know, they've been fed properly, they've had lots of light. The plants haven't been overly crowded in the field so that their leaves are shaded all the time. They get good light so that they're making lots of sugars. The other thing is that they are what's called a facultative short day plant, right? Not obligate. So that means short days are helpful, but they're not essential. It's the changing temperature regime that is a bigger trigger as far as flower initiation. So basically, if it's a warm fall, we can delay flowering a little bit. That you may have to leave them in the field a little longer. If it's a cooler fall and they've got bud formation, then you can put them in the cooler sooner. But typically, we need around 20 degrees Celsius for 14 hours continually to initiate buds. So growers keep track of outdoor temperatures, keep an eye on that to make sure that they've properly formed buds. And they don't just sit there and look at a computer. They go out there and they peel the apical meristem apart and look to see if the bud is in there. They can see the structures under a microscope or under a magnifying glass, and then they know that they've got bud formation. So basically, you know, you look at your apical buds first, but you don't stop there. Remember, I talked about at the very beginning, there's also axillary buds. So the growers will continue the fall field treatment until they are seeing axial buds on the petioles where they join the main stem. And at that point, then they know they're good to go. So then we move the plants into storage. So typically the plants are picked up from, usually grow in a field, and they're picked up on carts and placed into a dark section of the greenhouse where they often stack. These are greenhouse carts, one on top of the other. Look at how dense that is. Stack them densely into a greenhouse, and then they have to get all the leaves off them. So you can imagine if you have that many plants packed that densely in a barn, the leaves, well, the plants are going to start to get rot because it's moist in there. There's not a lot of airflow and there's no light, so the leaves aren't very useful, so they're going to sort of become chlorotic and fall off. Now, hydrangea growers don't want that, but they want the stems, and they don't want to have to, you know, break every leaf off. So what they do is they pack them in that area, and then they use an ethylene generator, an ethylene gas generator, which triggers defoliation. If you remember that from Plant Science 1, ethylene causes the breakdown of the sugar that holds the petiole against the stem. So that the ethylene produces is basically a plant hormone that's absorbed by the plant, moves up to the phloem, and the plant will break down the sugars that glue the petioles to the plant, and the leaves will fall off. In the old days, they used to use apples, bushels of apple. In fact, one apple bushel for every 400 square feet would produce enough ethylene gas to defoliate their crops. But typically, these days, we use an ethylene gas generator. And it takes about 10 days of exposure to ethylene in order for the leaves to start falling off. So at that point, the plants are then taken out of the area, and at camps in that video, you see the plants are put on a conveyor and they go by, in their case, pressurized water, which shoots all the leaves off the plants. And then a pot with just the raw branches, bare branches, comes out the other side. I've seen other greenhouses where they use leaf blowers and a conveyor, and the pots go by and the leaves are blown off the plant with leaf blowers. Whatever tickles your fancy. But you can see it is a mess. You know, there's leaves everywhere, and it's just slimy, and they have to do a lot of cleaning up when it's done. But basically, once they're done, you know, this is what they look like after they've been treated with ethylene. Once they're done, the plants look like this. Nice and clean branches. At the tips are your buds for next year's blooms. And all the energy, the carbon, is stored in the stems and the roots to drive the initial growth when you force them in February. So these hydrangeas need 1,000 hours of cooling in order for the buds to break their dormancy and actually bloom when you put heat on them. And it's really important that the buds don't freeze. So managing temperatures, keeping them nice and cool but not freezing is critical. It's tricky when you're trying to put the plants in the cooler in the fall. If it's a warm fall and you start getting too warm a temperature in your dark black house or in your cool section, you run the risk of botrytis igniting, which is that gray mold on the stems. And that will weaken and damage the branches, and those plants will be no good in February. So a lot of times the farmers have to spray the newly trimmed and de-leafed plants with a fungicide to protect them when they go into the cooler. So yeah, 800 to 1,000, typically 1,000 hours of cooling. That's roughly 4 to 5 degrees Celsius for 6 weeks. If you can't keep it that cool, 10 to 11 degrees Celsius for 8 weeks. And in that time, you cannot let them dry out. And you don't want to water the plants because I just talked about botrytis, right? So what they typically do is water the floors. This is a trick that a lot of fruit farmers use to keep their fruit from drying out in their coolers. They put water on the floor of the cooler, and that keeps the humidity up so the fruit doesn't shrivel and dry. There is, in the event of an emergency, you can spray your plants with gibberellic acid, and that will break the dormancy, just like we do with azaleas. But that's expensive and not necessary if you have your scheduling done properly. If you need to store the plants longer, like let's say you've done your 1,000 hours, but you're not ready to force them, things were a little ahead of schedule, then you turn the temperature down to about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, and then that slows everything down. You can hold the plants a bit, but be very careful about botrytis. So moving on to forcing. So at this point, you pull the plants out of the cooler and you place them in the greenhouse. So here you can see the leaves are starting to expand. Now here, when you pull them out depends on what you're doing here. Are you doing Mother's Day or are you doing Easter? What cultivar are you growing? They're anywhere from 80 to 100 days to finish when you force. So you got to get your calendar out and you've got to look to see when your crop's going to be sold. So this year, April 4th is Easter, right? So I'm going to average it and say, okay, let's count 90 days back from April 4th. That puts us on January 2nd. So technically we're too late for Easter already. Good thing we're not selling these for Easter. Now Mother's Day is very attainable, which is what we kind of try to target at the college. Although I don't know if we're going to be selling anything out of the greenhouse this year. But so May 9th is Mother's Day for 2021. Count 90 days back puts us February 8th. So this is some simple greenhouse scheduling, but stuff that's done all the time. But remember, people buy their plants before the holiday. So let's go a week earlier and make sure our plants are ready a week before. A lot of farmers now, quite a bit of their crop is pre-booked for sales. And so wholesalers will say, okay, I want 100 cases delivered on May 1st. I want 100 cases delivered on May 5th. Or I want 200 cases delivered April 25th. So you have to figure out your ship day based on your orders. And if you think about it, a lot of the retailers these days, they seem to push holidays earlier and earlier and earlier, right? It's like we've just barely got into Halloween and they're almost putting Christmas stuff up already, It's a bit bonkers. I feel like I'm being fleeced all the time, but anyways. So here's just a quick succession of what you would see in the early weeks of forcing. Leaf unfurling, and inside each one of these branches, ideally, is a bud. So that's quite a few there, right? There's 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. That's fantastic. Just some more eye candy, if that is that. So again, controlling sepal color. I had a student ask one year, so I've added this slide. White sepals do not change color. They are actually genetically missing this delphinidin pigment. So they're not capable of producing pink, white, pink or blue Sepal colors. Yes, getting a little confused. So if they're white, they stay white, right? So this delfinidin is what reacts with aluminum to make the blue pigment. Yeah, and one of the reasons why we talk about aluminum and pH is because aluminum is more available when pH is low. So we're trying to keep high aluminum levels in the soil and keep the pH down if we want blue. So here you can see the kind of pH, and it's really low, like 4.5. That's pretty low. Battery acid's around 2. 7 is neutral up here. So last few years, we've ended up with a lot of mauve at the college because they forget to add aluminum. But anyways, or I forget to add aluminum. But anyways, we have to do aluminum 2 to 3 times, even when we're forcing. Plants are forced from 80 to 100 days. There's our day-night temperature, 21, 16 nighttime. Once they're flowering, we cool it off, just like the poinsettias. It preserves petal color. Well, sepal color. I keep saying petal, but technically it's sepal. Basically, it preserves the pigmentation, right? Sunlight, actually, the photons interact with the pigments and start to break them down and bleach them out. So we try to keep it cool to reduce photooxidation and keep the light levels moderate. And of course, I'll keep saying it, keep the plant moist. They really like their water. So again, absence of aluminum makes the flowers pink, and presence of aluminum makes the flowers blue. And here's just a graph showing you the availability of aluminum with pH. So right around pH 4.75, there's a big inflection and aluminum becomes way more available. So below 4.75, from there on down, we get really good aluminum availability. Otherwise, what happens is it sticks to the soil particles and the plant can't access it. So in the summer, when we were field growing these crops, we would have done 2 applications, maybe 3 of aluminum. We would have avoided use of phosphorus when fertilizing, so 14-0-14. Everything in nitrate form, because ammonium seems to block aluminum. Keep our phosphate levels low. Add sulfur. Sometimes people will add sulfur, but typically we just add aluminum sulfate, which adds sulfur and aluminum. But seems to be getting a little bit repetitive here. But basically, it's important to understand that we're adding no phosphate and no ammonium because both of these will block aluminum or lock it out, as some people would say in the cannabis world. It's antagonistic. So we've got to avoid phosphate and ammonium when we're trying to have blue hydrangeas. If we want pink, it's just easy. We just go the opposite. We want high phosphorus and lots of ammonium and high pH in the soil. So that's not so difficult. Oftentimes we use what's called treble phosphate. So 0-45-0. All it is phosphate. It's just a ton of phosphate. Just chuck that in there and it blocks all the aluminum. So you're guaranteed pink blooms. So monoammonium phosphate is also used. That gives us both ammonium and lots of phosphate. See, look, we got 11 in the nitrate, in the nitrogen, but it's in ammonium form, and all the phosphate that's there, 53%. So then that keeps the pH high as well. And in between, you can feed 20-10-20 in between these uses. So typically we say 20-10-20 rotated with aluminum phosphate. Kind of a lot of stuff there. I already talked about that. Variations in blooming, yeah. I think they're pretty. The mauve kind of colors. So that's where you have less drastic blue. Maybe your pH is up around 5.5 to 6. And only 1 or 2 field applications of aluminum sulfate. And then maybe only 1 application when you're forcing. But basically, the control of sepal color is done through the addition of aluminum, keeping our pH low, and monitoring phosphate levels, phosphorus levels, and monitoring the form of nitrogen. So if we want blue, we avoid ammonium. If we want pink, we use way more ammonium. Obviously, we can't use 100% ammonium because that would impact the health of the plant, right? We've talked about that many times. As far as irrigation is concerned, we know they need lots of water. When they first come out of storage, there's no blooms yet, so we might be able to grow them a bit on the drier side and sort of kickstart the roots. But after that, we have to make sure we don't let them dry out. And once the roots are active, when you know they're active when you see new white tips, once they're active, then you start fertilizing regularly. Never let them dry. As far as the blooms are concerned, it's always sad when they dry because blooms that wilt do not recover. Unless they've only just barely wilted, but usually once they hang like this, they don't come back. So they end up as shrinkage. Another issue can be iron chlorosis. Usually irrigation induced, right? So too much. I keep talking about water. If you overwater, it can be an issue. If your pH is a bit high, now remember, iron availability increases as the pH lowers. So if you're growing blue hydrangeas, typically iron is very available, so it's not an issue. But if you're growing pink hydrangeas, then you got to be a bit more careful. If your water is high in carbonates, it will keep raising the pH and making your iron less available. In the case of growing pink hydrangeas, it's best to use EDDHA as a chelating agent for your iron because it has a broader pH range of availability. And as far as light is concerned, nothing crazy. Enough that the plants won't stretch, but we don't want to hit these plants with tons and tons of light. Once the plants are flowering, a lot of times people shade. And again, that is to keep the sepal colors intense. We don't want to wash them out, right? And this is important. Your spacing is really important. If you, just like poinsettias, if you cram too many pots on a bench, they grow up and not out. Instead of having a nice bushy dome of hydrangeas, you end up with a stovepipe and flowers bunched up at the top. And it doesn't look so nice when you take it off the bench. So you got to keep the spacing sufficient that there's space between the plants. If you are growing cooler, run the risk of longer internodes and larger leaves, which can be good. You do get a bigger flower if you grow cool. Just watch the stretch, right? Everything's a compromise. 12 degrees Celsius is ideal for finishing. That's quite cool. It's sometimes hard to do that in Ontario. You know, we can have warm springs or cool springs. It's really hard to know. But, you know, on the whole, it's not so hard when you first start in February, right? So as you head towards May, things start to sort of accelerate as the temperatures get warm. But for sure, your first 60 out of your 100 days shouldn't be a problem to maintain 12 degrees. We grow a little warmer at the college, and it's worked for us. I think we're usually around 16 in that zone. That's the middle zone. You can use photoperiod control to speed up or like basically shorten your time. So by using long days, so that means supplementing with grow lights, you can decrease the time to 4. So if you're looking at your calendar and you realize that you're not going to make it, then you start turning grow lights on and you'll pick up the pace. And an added benefit is that you get a bigger plant and flower. But, you know, running grow lights costs money, so that's a business decision as well. Growth regulators are used fairly regularly in all ornamental crops, and hydrangeas are no different. We talked about using day length to, you know, speed up a crop, but you get longer internodes. It's important that you spray with B9 to keep those internodes at a decent height. If you pulled hydrangeas out of the cooler, put them on the bench and forced them and never sprayed B9, they get really long and tall, and the branches tend to sort of bend with the weight of the flowers, and you don't want that. So typically you're looking at every other week applying a fairly high dose, 2,500 to 3,000 ppm of B9 to keep those internodes under control. Important limit. Once the buds are about the size of a dime, you stop spraying. Otherwise, your B9 is going to affect the bud growth, and they'll end up buried in the foliage and small. So definitely avoid that. But you still have negative diff or morning drops as a tool to control height. So if you're getting your crop ready for sale, so 2 weeks before you're going to ship, you're going to, drop your nighttime temperature, ease up on your fertilizer, shade to prevent wilting and keep your color in your flowers. Anything above 500 watts per square meter in your global radiance, you're going to close the shade. And of course, really, really important, never let it wilt. Typical pests, there's nothing really common with hydrangea because of the way they're grown and how they start and grow. It's really not a big deal. I've seen aphids. It's about it. We get thrips sometimes at the college because thrips are in our greenhouse, but typically aphids are what we run into, and it's not that hard to control them. Botrytis, powdery mildew, these are a little more common, mostly botrytis. But again, if you have adequate spacing, some of those photos, if you look back in the slides on the bench, there's way too many plants on the bench, and they're going to run the risk of botrytis or even powdery mildew. I have not seen much in the way of viruses with hydrangeas, but what you're looking at here is scarring from feeding, right? So these leaves would have been immature in the furled stage here where the aphids were feeding, and that's the damage that they caused as the leaves expanded and revealed that. Some pictures, some reminders of the process. Look at all these plants in that cooler. Like, that's astonishing. These are all sorts of layers just crammed in there. Just astonishing. And then there's a hydrangea farm, which kind of gives you an idea. This is all the outdoor space. All these plants are grown on a field in the summer, right? And then they're rooted out, grown in the field, right? Then they're put into the cooler. This is their cooler, big cooler, stacked high on carts. And then in February, they have their own greenhouse, so they can force some of them. But obviously, these guys are selling the vast majority to other customers, which is just like Bill Camp's, the Camp's greenhouse. So, all right, and then there's a whole assortment of colors. Our hydrangeas are arriving sometime in early February, so the college will get them going. I hope we're on campus by then. I don't know what to say. I think the premier has something to say about that. All right, take care, everyone. Remember to check your TLPs because I've got regular quizzes to keep you guys engaged. So, and make sure you're learning the stuff. All right. Any questions? Feel free to email me anytime. Okay. Bye.